Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Director's Chair, our weekly live stream forum where we here at Into Growth take the time to explore the intersection between leadership and creativity. Our focus has been on looking at cultivating a more creative mindset in ourselves and how we as leaders can sharpen our creative edge and fulfill our responsibility of bringing out the creative energy of our teams and employing creative activities to achieve innovative outcomes. And a common anchor and focus of our exploration in many of our discussions has been two things. One, the traits that highly creative leaders have inherently or actively cultivated in themselves and others. And two, the sometimes dramatic and artistic tools that we as leaders can employ to cultivate and drive the creative process. On the former, we've looked at the traits of optimism, curiosity, inclusivity, and creating a safe place to explore and create, empathy, authenticity, the subject of our last discussion, and courage and resilience, and also comfort with tension and the importance of leveraging this in the creative process. On the latter, the tools we have at our disposal to help cultivate creativity in our teams and to drive creative outcomes, we've touched on storytelling, improvisation and theater, or lessons that we can take from the stage into the boardroom. We've talked about the importance of casting, which was the analogy that we used there, and the assembling of culture add versus culture fit, and dramatic visioning, or moonshots, as Brian referenced in a previous session. And today we're going to discuss another tool around which the last two traits I referenced a moment ago, courage and comfort with tension, are perhaps most important, and that is confrontation. Confrontation is necessary at times in any relationship, one-to-one or group, and within most any journey or creative process. In fact, I would take the position that creation and creativity require it. Ideas have to clash. We all need to be challenged, and nothing ever worth doing came without crossing swords, so to speak, on some level, or within ourselves or with others. So today we're going to talk about confrontation and how to open and resolve creative differences. Brian, I love this topic, as we were saying a moment ago, largely because it is one of the creative tools that I'm perhaps least comfortable with. To your point, I don't think anyone ever really likes it, but certainly it's something we need to learn to become comfortable with and deal with and leverage as leaders. So if I can ask you to kick it off here for us, and let's talk about the importance of that to the creative process, because I don't know that that's fully understood. So I'll get on the same page there.
So I'll start with just the word confrontation. It's a bad word. I don't love the word confrontation. And anyone who says, God, I'm so good at confrontation, well, you're probably a jerk, or you lack self-awareness. So it's more about making sure our job as leaders, making sure that everyone's voice is heard and that the best ideas come forward. And so if teammates view this as getting their voice out there or adding to a creative process as a form of confrontation, you lose whatever percentage of the ideas go right outside the window. So throughout my career, I've always tried to find the best ways to pull ideas out of people so they feel comfortable with that, and it's actually not a confrontation. I'll give you an example. About 20 years ago, I hired this really terrific intern, and we hired smart people. I don't care if someone's 80. Ideas matter. We want to hear your voice. And so sometimes creative process, especially for this case, this woman was 20, can be overwhelming. People have positional power, CEOs in the room, and divisional presidents in the room. So afterwards, I said to her, I said, listen, you're crazy smart. You should participate in these meetings, even though there may be visibly some creative tension going on in the room. So I found this thing that I always tell people, I used to say every day, be respectful always, but not too polite. Be respectful always, but not too polite. I said this to this intern 20 years ago, it's okay to be respectful, but not too polite. So as we progress in this conversation, it's really not as much about confrontation. It's about you finding tools to make sure that your voice is heard, and more importantly, that the people around you also understand that you've heard their voice. And therefore, in some cases, it's more creative tension than confrontation. And that's how I think about these things.
So kind of that comfort with, you have to be comfortable with tension because there's always going to be that tension. And if you're not comfortable with that, your voice is not going to get out there. Others' voices are not going to get out there, and nothing. You're going to reach a certainly less than optimal outcome.
You have to get comfortable. You're right. Sometimes we say in order to lead, you have to become a little bit more comfortable with ambiguity. Likewise, it's like any other muscle. You do build your ability to become more comfortable with creative tension. Again, you can see me avoiding this confrontation word because confrontation has its own buildup, but it's really about being creative. Being comfortable with this creative tension process and the ability to make sure that your voices are heard. And it's the job of the leader to make sure you pull that out. And there are tools, and we'll get into it. There's some things that I've read that I've used throughout my life that we can get into as we progress through the conversation. But it's about getting comfortable and building your toolbox around it.
Yeah, to Brian's point, that creative tension is constructive, but it can come, it can have the adverse effect if you as a leader don't build that necessary framework to allow for that confrontation. We talked about building teams and making sure that you have trust and authenticity, and setting those foundations are essential so that when there's confrontation later on, people know that you're coming from a good place, right? You're not attacking each person's, person when they have an idea that you might disagree with. And that all comes with fostering that teamwork and that end vision. The example is like, say, a basketball team, right? At the end of the day, this team wants to win the basketball game, right? They want to win the championship. They want to go all the way. They're facing a team that, maybe one person thinks a 3-2 defense zone would be the best, right? And then one's like, oh, no, we should do, man-to-man defense. Well, the end goal is to win that game, right? And the leader, the coach says, hey, we need to win this game and we need to make sure that we lock down this key player, yada, 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 X, Y, and Z. That confrontation is good. You can debate and you can maybe try, on a few possessions, try the two, the man-to-man and then switch to a 3-2, whatever it is. But you need to have that framework that you are all in it together and every idea is valid to get to that end goal. And like Brian said, not just building that team you need to build that team to establish that trust, but there are things that you can do, throughout that process to ensure that, that trust and that alignment is still there, months into a process.
So Tom, to your point, the leader's job largely being to, not only Brian, to your point in our first thread, to ensure that creative ideas surface. Right. Tom, to your point, the important thing being that there's going to be tension as ideas surface, and one has to manage that tension lest it get out of control. Too much of any good thing, right?
There's a comment that, my apologies, Dan. There's a comment that just kind of came through. It's attack the problem, not the person. And so always remember that. And it's okay to have creative tension to the fringe. And we're all smart human beings. We know what the fringe means. And I'll give you an example. About 20 years ago, I put an entire company through something called Crucial Conversations and Crucial Confrontations. I didn't create it. It's a series of books by go find it. It's terrific. So one of the stories that I think about all the time, and when you go through training 20 years ago and something still stays with you, it's very apropos of this particular conversation. So one of the stories in this training, they talk about parents and how you can be a perfect parent, a perfect leader. 95% of your day, thoughtful, great empathy with your children and your family. But then at the end of the day, you got back from work, you're done with dinner, you want a little break time for yourself, and now you're trying to put the kids to bed. But you've been flawless all day. You're an amazing parent. But then at around 8:30, 9 o'clock, or whenever time your bedtime is, then it all can break down. You start to scream. You start to lose it. So then little Sally and Timmy remember mom and dad as screamers, even though you're flawless most of the time. So the point with that is, with Crucial Conversations and Crucial Confrontations, is to keep that in mind. Don't go over that brink. And when you do, just give yourself a timeout. And those are the kinds of tools, and they're learned. You can just read the books. They're fantastic. Crucial Confrontations, Crucial Conversations. And it'll help you sort of keep those kinds of things in mind.
So coming back to the importance of self-awareness and self-knowledge and kind of knowing where your limit is as well. But Tom, to your earlier point as well, if we're managing that tension well, we're reminding our teams of the common ground and bringing it back to that. And so that's probably one of the more effective tools in ensuring that everyone's on the same page and focused on the same goal at the end of the day. We're rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, and a big part of that is it's draining, right? Confrontation is draining. It takes a lot of energy, right? And it might feel like you're backed against a corner and somebody else is in another corner, and to manage that stress and that conflict, breaks are incredibly important, right? You should not be doing these really long confrontational meetings that last 2-3 hours at a time, right? You should break it up. Have a coffee break where the people that are on opposite sides can talk about it, have a coffee together and build those bonds, build that friendship, build that network, that commonality again, right? It's not like never should you sit in a room and just be duking it out for 3 hours. And so it's just important as a leader to kind of measure, the tension in the room and know when it's time to take those breaks or when to bring everyone back together and create that, that awareness that, hey, we're in this together. This is the end vision. Let's keep the boat rowing.
We talk about and in live streams all over the world, podcasts all over the world, the Brene Browns of the world, who I love. They talk about authenticity in leadership. And this also applies to confrontation. People know authentically if I have an issue with Laura or vice versa, or not an issue, that's even the wrong word, but if there's creative tension around an idea, Laura will know if I'm authentically trying to hear her. Mm-hmm. She will absolutely know that. Or am I trying to beat her? Am I trying to win? So if we keep that in mind, am I authentically trying to hear Laura so that the best idea emerges or whatever the issue is? That's just something to keep in mind. So what I might write down if I'm in the middle of a confrontation, I may stop and say, right, as I'm doing right now, write the word authenticity on my page. Mm-hmm. Recenters me, make sure that Laura understands that I care about her. I'm not trying to win all the time. I want the best reserve. So whatever tools that you can, tricks and of the trade you can employ to these confrontational situations, the better off we all are.
Brian, I like that. And maybe Laura, you may have a thought here as well, but jumping off point is that connection between, to your point, Brian, confrontation and authenticity. We often talk, I was doing a little reading here before our session, and sort of the notion of like that, the tool to employ in some of these discussions of the devil's advocate, someone to play that role and how common and popular that is. But the notion here was that may not be as valuable as authentic dissent, or you really feel like someone actually just have another viewpoint here, and the dialogue we're having here is genuine. This is really someone's opinion that will encourage others to actually bring out their real true thoughts uninhibited, which is what we need, to your point, Brian, and as leaders, in bringing the ideas to the surface and our responsibility. So that authenticity being very, very important.
So
Laura,
go, Laura.
Yeah, I think, I absolutely agree with that, right? Because I think that the devil's advocate role can be really important in just introducing a diverse thought to the conversation, or a different solution to the one that's being proposed. And it could also be important to just kind of keep the herd from all just being agreeable, right? Because agreeableness can be very efficient, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the best solutions, the most innovative solutions. But I think for me, there's a difference between confrontation and conflict. And I think that confrontation, inherently, as Brian kind of started this conversation, it has kind of a negative connotation, right? Like, ooh, I don't like confrontation. But I think as a leader, especially in cultivating creativity in a group, confrontation can be a little bit more innocuous. So it can be more of calling on the person that doesn't speak up, getting different ideas. Because if, say a leader presents a plan, right, or a course of action, or a coach does, and if everyone is just like, yeah, that works, you're not getting diversity of thought. You're not seeing other potential solutions that might actually be more effective in the long run. And so by encouraging, pull holes in this, what's wrong with it? Then that is kind of like healthy confrontation, and that's more of just dialogue, right? And dialogue is different than debate. which is much more like, here, it's black and white, like here's the right, here's the wrong, or like this is one side, this is the other. Whereas dialogue, which can be part of confrontation, especially if an effective leader is enabling it, is more like, okay, so that's Brian's opinion. I don't entirely agree. I see that opinion, but this is how I feel. And then Tom jumps in and says, well, this is my perspective. That is confrontation, right? But that can ultimately lead to this creative solution. Whereas if you're in a room just duking it out and you need to all take a break, that's more conflict, right? Like that is, and that's where it comes into play really important of understanding you're never going to come to the same agreement, but you can come to consensus.
It's an important distinction.
I think so.
Yeah. Good. And I wonder this, I was thinking about this too, and actually reflecting here for a moment that I don't know if either of you, Laura and Tom, were involved in debate growing up or in high school. But it's always something that I think maybe it was because I sort of was very uncomfortable with confrontation that I never got involved in it. But I loved theater and spent time doing that. And like the tension that we would act out on stage was so fun. But I actually, it's a regret I have actually, that I didn't get involved in debate because, man, you know, just what that requires of you, just kind of the thinking that I think it, in my impression from friends who were involved, it just the way it sharpened them, just as people, their thought process, how they would think critically as they went, and just even just in our own interactions as a result of them being involved in that. It just seemed like something that just really, really sharpened them as individuals. So, well, were you involved in debate growing up?
I was, yeah. And I didn't compete largely because I competed in swimming, which took up every weekend, but I did take multiple speech and debate classes and communication, something, argument, debate, all of that. I loved it. And one thing that I think was really useful skill is it teaches you to listen. Right. And so that is one of the things that, you know, to the example that both Tom and Brian brought up of like, know when you have to take a step back, know when you need to break, or when you're leading, when your team does, and just say, hey, like, let's table this. We'll come back to it. But I think the thing that's really important about learning and being involved in speech and debate or argument and debate is that you're forced to listen to the other person, even if it's just to rebut them. Because that's how you debate, right? Is you listen to their point, you're like thinking about it, you're taking notes, and then you're kind of cross-referencing that with your point of view. And then so when it's your time to rebut their argument, you're still kind of like regurgitating what they said, which is really important because that is totally different than just coming at someone with your opinion, just coming at them nonstop. You are saying, okay, I hear you. So I know that you think that, you know, chocolate ice cream is better. I heard that, and these are your reasons. But this is why I'm telling you that pistachio is better. You know, so it's like, it's very different than just like, this is the right way, and this is all the reasons. You're saying, this is what I heard. I acknowledge that. And this is why it's different from my perspective.
So maybe it's important for a couple of reasons. One, I'm taking from that, Laura, that in debate, it forces you to listen really, really well. And that's critical in building trust with someone else and being heard. Everyone wants to be heard. And when they know that they've been listened to, two, you're more likely to be able to win them over. One, because they know that you've heard them and that you've appreciated them and you've respected them. But then ultimately, you're using their arguments directly to put it any other way, to win, basically, because you need to do that in order to overcome in an actual debate setting. But I'm wishing I would have gotten involved in that.
I did a debate class in high school. I mean, this was years ago. But one thing that it did teach me to do was disassociate me and my viewpoint from the issue at hand. And when you kind of disassociate it, when you're up there arguing your point or the point, you're not as emotionally invested in it. Because a lot of times when someone's coming at you from a different perspective, you are tied to this thing and this is where you sit, is where you stand, and this is my point, and you get emotionally vested. And that's not a healthy place to be, because then that confrontation becomes conflict, right? Because you're associating a viewpoint on what's going to be successful with you, the person. And I think a big point of that debate is realizing that, this is an idea. It has nothing to do with me or a person, or if someone disagrees, if they're not, saying no to Tom. It's just they're disagreeing with, the course of action. I think a good thing with debate is it's able to separate that emotional aspect to it. When you are able to separate that emotional aspect to it, you can concentrate on other, either logos, pathos, ethos, the other ones, and you can concentrate on those in order to try and, get the argument across to the other person. Otherwise, they'll just be caught up in this emotional spin. And so your side is actually more likely to come out on top if you're able to disassociate it. And if you look at, if you look at lawyers in the courtroom, they're some of the best debaters or negotiators, we'll call it. There's zero emotion, right? They might be very adamant, and they know where the great orators, they know where to stress different areas, and they rely on, pathos, ethos, and logos, but they're not emotionally getting worked up over it. And I think, if you're able to disassociate that, the cause with you, the person, that becomes a lot more constructive than it would cause conflict.
Yeah, I imagine if one is forced to, I always wanted to be put in a situation where I was, and I don't think I've ever, to my memory, been in a situation where I was representing a case or a point of view that I didn't agree with, and I like the being forced into a situation where you've got to take that stance and research it really well. I imagine it just could be a really great learning opportunity as well. So good. And actually, a quick I'm actually glad I didn't do this, but I considered law school for a short period of time. I think my personality would be least suited to the law. But it was for this very reason, because I thought how interesting that would be. The notion of being in the courtroom and the drama that ensues in there was always very attractive. So like litigation sounded really interesting. So I'm glad I didn't do it though. Business school taught was the right call, for sure. Sure.
What do you guys think about the role of, let's talk about the role of recovery skills in a confrontation. Again, I don't love the word confrontation, but it is an important word. Recovery skills. In this class, Crucial Confrontations, Crucial Conversations, they talk about the fact that when a relationship is openly bad, that it has a chance of recovery. If a relationship is not openly bad, it's quietly bad, it has, they say, zero chance. So that brings, to me at least, all of us will overreach in a conversation. Hopefully it never gets to the point where you say things which is just childish that you can't take back. But we do push, and we know when we've pushed too far. And all too often we work with people or around people who just refuse to either apologize or have what I call recovery skills. Pride and arrogance are deadly sins for a reason. Mm-hmm. And so if it's okay with you guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you recover from situations where you've known that perhaps you've overstepped a little bit, and what are some of the toolkits that you have that help you through that?
That's a good question.
Great topic.
Fantastic question, Brian. I mean, for me, I try and put all hubris aside. I really do. And when you might have gone a little bit too far, and through, it's kind of harder here with in today's world through Zoom, but through body language and things of that nature, when somebody on the other end might be getting a little bit uncomfortable or whatnot. And you might not be able to kind of like stop it in the moment because you're like a freight train going full speed and you just can't hit that brake fast enough. But after, during that coffee break, we'll call it, or at the end of the day, I think it's essential that you go to that person, you say, hey, Laura, like I got really excited in there. Half the stuff, like maybe I don't even mean, it just kind of got a little bit too far. I'm sorry if it came across as too strong. This is just something that I'm just really passionate about because I know our end goal of getting to this number at the end of the quarter. I really want to do that, and that's why I just get really passionate behind it. It's just not nothing against you or anything. It's just what I'm trying to I just want to see us win here, right? And just that little bit, it just that that conflict, it just automatically disarms the situation, right? It just disarms it. It might have been Laura that was a little bit too strong, right? And who knows? But I'm just taking this moment as I don't really like that feeling, and I don't think it's good to let it just fester. And so I think those conversations are great bringing out in the open, and by coming completely unarmed and throwing them down, throwing your hands up in the air, saying hey, I'm sorry, got a little heated in there. don't take it personally. I just get a little bit excited. And that's one thing that I do. Another thing, as a leader, if you're not even in the debate, one thing that is great that leaders can do is reward the people's viewpoint, or the person's viewpoint that doesn't quote unquote win. Right? They might believe very passionately about something, but at the end of the day, we end up going with another person's view. That person should still be rewarded for, hey, that was an awesome idea. I know we didn't end up going with it, but this is the type of leaders that we need to stand up for, for what's right, or for what they believe is right, or their course of action. And by rewarding people to be passionate and to stick to their, what they believe, their opinions, is a good way to make sure people aren't afraid to voice their opinions later on.
Yeah. Tom, I'll follow on that point too. I liked what you. I liked I think just add to your point about sort of extending a hand across the table and saying, "Hey, look, I kind of felt like this situation, like I may have been a little too strong there." Even if it wasn't you, taking ownership directly, just I think generates or typically has the effect of generating just an incredible amount of respect from the other side for you. It just like puts the guards down completely and just puts everyone back on a level playing field.
Kill people with kindness. That's really my motto.
That's right. Which Tom, I'll praise you for a second, because you have done that. I've seen you do that directly in some situations where I don't know if I could have been.
Apparently, I practice what I preach. Good to know.
You do, and I appreciate it. It's good.
There's something that the founder of Into Growth, Mike Myatt, I've known him a long time. And there's something that he said to me maybe as long as 16 years ago. And it was about navigating ideas with the team. But I took what he said and I applied it to every part of my life. And it was something simple, and I say it 3 times a day. And he said, never trip over dollars to pick up pennies. And what he really means by that is don't be small. So if you're in a confrontation or a creative disagreement, this notion of, am I picking up dollars to pick up pennies here? Am I just being small? And little tools that I bring about, I've got, a large family and run large businesses, small teams, and I try to keep that in my mind at all times, whether it's an actual financial issue or a interpersonal issue. Don't trip over dollars to pick up pennies.
That's a very good reminder.
I'd like to thank you, Mike Myatt, for that, if you're listening.
Yeah, you gotta keep our focus on those things. So that's good. Laura, did you? It looked like you maybe had a thought there.
Yeah, well, I love that. I love the recovery aspect. I agree with Tom wholeheartedly. My first thing is absolutely hands down, you have to own it. If you were out of line, you need to own that. If you said something unfair, by being frustrated and emotionally charged, you need to own that. But I also think it's really important to have the courage and the authenticity and the vulnerability to let someone know if maybe you felt like you were treated unfairly in that debate because they were emotionally charged. And that is incredibly hard to do, especially if they are your senior or just someone really respected. And so I think that that's also part of the recovery is, the ability. Do you guys remember I statements from school? Do you remember that, like from elementary school?
The
I statements.
The I statements?
Yeah. So this is what you do with like young children when you're teaching them conflict resolution is you want it to, instead of being accusatory, you want the kid to say, I feel this way. This is how I feel because of this, instead of like, you did this to me, blah, 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 like how kids can do that. So it's teaching really small children to start to say, this is how I feel versus you did this. And so kind of taking that I statement, but obviously as an adult and, potentially in a professional setting can be really challenging, but important as part of the recovery. And
Laura,
then
sorry, go ahead. Say the second part. Yeah.
No, because I was going to segue. So go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, I love that part. And I think it's crucial in any circumstance to give feedback. And one of the goals of feedback, not to say, hey, I'm gonna stop picking on you, Laura. I'm gonna say, hey, Brian, you did this wrong and I didn't like that. And over here you did an all right job, but at the end of the day, you did this and it just wasn't up to par. Right? Like that's one way you can give feedback. Another way is to say, hey, Brian, it seems like you might have, rushed that paper, and what I got at the end of the day wasn't necessarily fully there. And, for me, at the end of the day, this is how I felt. I felt that it wasn't good enough, and I had to spend like 20, 30 minutes to an hour fixing things up and making it to a level where we could present it to the board. And just like, and it just, for me, it just felt like it almost was like a letdown a little bit. And I know that you could do a little bit better. And you pause, and then you wait for Brian to, you give that pause for Brian to think about what he did, how it made you feel. And then it gives him the chance to say, okay, I understand that, Tom, but I have X, Y, and Z going on in the background of my family right now. And it's like, oh, got it. Wow. Okay. Got it, Brian. Right. But you want to just make sure that you give good feedback, but that good feedback shows that what it did to you as well. And so I love that part, Laura, that you say, that you brought up, that it's just incredibly important that it's right. It's a person's acting not in a vacuum, but it has effect on other people, and to show them that it has effect. So I think that's crucial. So sorry for interrupting you. Go ahead.
No, thank you. Great example. The other thing I was going to say about the recovery piece is I also think that, again, this goes back to like social awareness, self-awareness, authenticity is just like, do I even want to argue about this anymore? Like, is there apathy involved? Because that is so important. And if there is apathy, whether it's professional or personal, I mean, I was watching a movie the other day because I was sick, and I don't even remember what it was, but it was this couple, and they got into this huge fight, with all the friends, and everyone's standing there awkwardly. And then the woman goes and apologizes, and she's so mortified. And the one person goes, if my ex-husband and I fought like that, we'd still be married. And that's such an important statement, because that is the danger of apathy in confrontation or in dialogue. Like, if you're just to the point where like, I don't care. You don't care about the mission of the organization. You don't care about the cohesiveness of the relationship, professional or personal. And so I think that's an important part of recovery also, is like, do I want to take onus? Do I want to, give someone constructive feedback about how the situation made me and others feel? Or do I just not even care to try? And so I think that's a really important part of confrontation as well, and creativity.
And to your point, Laura, this issue of navigating confrontation and recovery skills is so important, because if any of us were to look at a business and we didn't see their end result, their numbers, their EBITDA, the revenue. If we had access to only one thing and it was done well, appropriately from an HR perspective, if we looked at a company's engagement score, and if that engagement score is off the charts, I don't need to look at the net revenue, the EBITDA, nothing. I know it's a top performing company. If they're poor, I don't have to look at the numbers. So this issue of how we navigate relationships, and if it comes to the point, Tom, from the top, where you have a company filled with apathy, your engagement score is going to be awful, your business is going to be awful, and then ultimately it's the road to perdition, the road to ruin. Yeah. It's just so important.
I think this is a really good point to maybe hover on for a second. Laura, thank you for bringing us to it. Creativity or a conflict or confrontation is not the enemy at all. It's apathy. Your point about relationships, like if we, it's a good reminder maybe that when there's conflict, when there's tension, people are invested. That's actually a sign of health in many respects. It may be uncomfortable, but it's still a sign of health. And if that starts to disappear, people no longer care, to Brian's point, people are no longer engaged, that's probably as difficult to recover as trust is. And so ensuring that people care and are invested enough to fight is really, really important. And maybe, Tom, to your point earlier, as leaders, our job is to, to ensure that the tension is managed in a room such that it's healthy, and we're bringing out people's ideas. But let's maybe take a moment to talk about how we can ensure that people are remaining engaged, to Brian's point, and they do care, and they stay at the table. Because if they walk away from the table, we're not in a good place, and bringing them back to the table is just so difficult. So how do we keep people at the table? What are some ways we can ensure that conflict doesn't get out of hand and people continue to care?
Well, I would like to bring up just one thing. I know in the past we talked about the importance of establishing and building teams, right? The very importance of it, and sometimes we mentioned you might have it wrong, or it might be right at one area of a business, and then when you kind of move to another stage, that teamwork is not what that dynamic is not what you need anymore. And so as a leader, when you have these, well, I'll call them bad apples, right? Because everyone's been on a team that's had them, right? If you haven't, I mean, God bless, it's quite a miracle. But so everyone's been on a team that's had the bad apple, and as a leader, you need to know when, you need to be able to identify those bad apples. And it might not necessarily be remove that person and kick them off the team, but it could be, put them in, timeout or for a little bit, and so you've seen this all the time on sports teams, right? You have the hot dog all-star player and the coach benches him for a game or whatever it is, because he or she is getting, too worked up or too cocky, and the teamwork that is essential for any team sport to be successful is you need to have that teamwork. And if you can't have that teamwork because you have one person who's being a little bit myopic and cocky and wants to do everything themselves, then it's going to be disastrous for everyone. And so as a leader, you need to be able to identify those bad apples and bring them aside. And either, maybe if it's a recurring problem, maybe it's best that we get rid of that person and bring someone else in. Or, maybe you can do like an improvement plan, or at least let them be made aware of what's happening. Give that feedback that we talked about. Hey, you came across as very strong the last 3 meetings. Everyone in the room felt a little bit tense because of the way that you were coming forward. Give that feedback, see how he or she responds, and then make a judgment call after that. But you need to be able to identify those bad apples early, because otherwise it's just disastrous.
That's a good point. Laura, bless you. With that, so it made me think immediately, just a bit of a tangent, but I was at the gym the other day, and what was on, Hoosiers was on, if you guys remember that movie.
Great movie.
Like we could spend a whole session just talking about that movie, I think. But like there's a scene where the coach, Gene Hackman, has like a player just sit he benches him and just doesn't and they play with 4 players, not 5, on the floor. And I think just the effect that had on the team, and I can't remember the full context, but to your point, maybe sometimes it's like people seeing that that's being done, and that the leader cares enough about the culture to preserve it, protect it, will also help to ensure that people stay at the table and remain engaged. If they see that there's no consequences for this piece, or the culture is not protected, they're going to lose interest. They may start to lose them, for sure.
And especially in a creative process, as Laura mentioned, like when you start having that apathy and people stop feeling the need to express their ideas, the diversity of their background, their perspective, their lens on life. And when people stop, giving their opinions and their thought process, then it just becomes an echo chamber. Their apathy becomes an echo chamber for whoever has the bullhorn, right? And then that creativity is just stifled. And as a leader, you need to make sure that never happens.
The importance of free speech back to as well. It's Brian, we talked about engagement scores before, and I have to admit this is not something that I'm overly familiar with, and just in terms of how those are measured and how different companies look at engagement, how they take the pulse of that. What are some things that you've done in the past to ensure that engagement scores are up, that people are at the table and engaged and just ready to continue contributing at a larger scale too, like not outside of a small group, at a massive scale?
I would say a significant number of companies do not have the courage to have an engagement score. So an engagement is like an EKG for your heart. If you are having a heart attack and you go to a cardiologist or the emergency room, they'd love to have a baseline, because an EKG only tells them where you are at that moment in time. So if you're going to do a professional engagement, have a professional engagement process, you need to have a pro do it. And that engagement process includes absolute anonymity, absolute confidentiality. So you can get the truth of the organization. It goes back to trust. They have to believe you as a leader, that the HR leader or whoever's in charge of it is not leaking that to the big boss, the CEO. So they have to believe, and it has to be true, that when you're building out an engagement process, it starts with a global survey if your company's that large, and a pro will put it together, and then you will have your baseline, and then depending upon your ethos or your process, every 3 months or maybe every 6 months, it's another check. You constantly get your EKG, your engagement score for your company. It's just fundamentally important. The reason I say it requires courage, because if you're the CEO and you've been a CEO for a year, well, and your engagement scores aren't very good, very strong, who does that reflect on? It reflects on the CEO. And therefore, most are reticent to do that because it gives their competitors, and we all have our internal competitors, boards and other places, arrows to shoot. But it's just a critical part. Small team, large team, you have to have that in an engagement process. And I would argue that very few do because of that issue of courage. But if they do it and they see their engagement scores skyrocket, I mean, candidly, if you're a PE firm or if your engagement scores are off the charts, that should be a part of the deal process. But very few people, without getting too far afield, very few people actually do it and do it well. But they should.
Yeah, incredibly important. It's good. So coming back to keeping people at the table in situations where there may be even high degree of high tension. We talked about the importance or leading in high tension situations in a past session and how that can have an impact on creativity as a whole as well. And in those situations where there's high tension, you're working to keep people from stepping away from the table. Again, very, very important to bring them back. Before we wrap up, I'd love to revisit this here a little bit and connect it back to that the tension where we started before. Tom, I'm curious from your time as a combat officer as well, situations where there's going to be very, very high stress and people might be, which might create argument after the fact. Maybe you're not in the heat of the moment where lives are on the line, but you're certainly in an environment where tensions can run high and certainly blood runs thick. But what are some things that you have seen to help keep people engaged at the table and not maybe walk away in some of those situations as well?
Yeah, it goes to Laura's point about that, the resolution and just kind of the coming back at the end of so a lot of times when things get, pretty heated, you just, luckily the military is pretty hierarchical. So when things start hitting the fan, right, people automatically go to the leader and look for, direction. Sometimes in other situations, there could be, conflict, and it might not be life-threatening. It just might be, do this, or people yelling just because that's, the MO of the Army, people yelling and making commands and stuff. But at the end of the day, one thing that the Army does really well, we do these things called AARs, after action reviews. And that's when everyone comes together, regardless of if it was the best mission in the world or the worst mission. And you come together and you discuss specific actions that people made, what went well, what didn't go well, how did someone react, how should they have reacted differently, and everyone is completely open, right? They're completely open to feedback, because that feedback at the end of the day is going to make everyone better and make the team stronger and a more a better unit, we'll just say. And so a big part of any type of a conflict is that resolution at the end, and that AAR, that after action review, where people can come together and look inner about, what did they do that might have been, wrong, or, and even if you don't know if it's wrong, maybe you say, hey, I made a left when I should have made a right. I can see why right would have been, might have been the better choice. Can anyone give me some feedback on, what were what was the good things about the left, or maybe what was better with the right, if I made that right turn. And so it's really people coming together, and it comes to that trust aspect, right? If you don't have that trust and people are saying, telling you, no, you did this, or you did this, you just look like you're getting attacked, right? And so you need to make sure that trust is there in a group, and that you have those reviews to better the team, not to, tell someone they were wrong or right, but it's to make the team better. And so that's a big part on any really intense situation, is to have that, and we talked about before, there's, that confrontation and one-on-one conversation at the end of it. Sometimes it's good to have the whole group, right? The whole group was there, the whole group witnessed it. And now if it's like a fight or something like that, probably not in the whole group, but it's not a bad idea to bring the whole team together to see, you know, what was everyone's, you know, reaction to something or whatnot. But you got to be careful with those group conversations. So, because if you don't have that trust, it can become, you know, a mob mentality rather than something that's going to be, you know, uplifting.
I imagine, Tom, that it just virtually, well, especially in situations like that, but in virtually any team, if that's an established norm that you're going to come together regardless of how well something went or how poorly something went, and people will have a chance to kind of voice or give their opinion on, hey, this is, or I was uncomfortable with this, or we should have done it this way. That notion that we're always working to improve, and we will get better from here. If that after action review is an established norm in almost any situation, I think that will keep people engaged too, knowing that, like, look,
for sure,
we're that's our, like, this may have been just a disaster, but this is one engagement, and the next one will be better. And if that's just something that people expect, I have a chance to voice something about that.
Yeah, if you only have it at the end of when things go wrong, then it just becomes an exercise for public shaming, right? And that's not a good thing. That's not beneficial to a group. And so if it is a habit, and you do it every time afterwards, that actually builds that team cohesion, because you end up learning, you know, Tom made this decision, but that's because, you know, he's maybe a little bit weaker in this area, but if we can help him out there, then, you know, that problem won't happen again, or whatever it is. It just builds, you know, you get to know everyone's idiosyncrasies, what they're good at, what they're bad at, and how to, you know, maximize the effectiveness of the whole. And so, yeah, those AARs for sure should be, you know, commonplace and not one-off.
Certainly a way that, bringing this back to the large kind of focus of our exploration, creativity, that constant look to improve and to adjust and to get better. And taking the chance to look at failure for a second in those situations and how we could have done things better is a critical way to ensure that we're increasingly creative as we're moving forward as well, I think. So good. Well, I think we're coming up on time here, but I want to pause here for a second and see if we could touch on any last thoughts on this connection between conflict or confrontation, creativity, and even the recovery that we touched on here as well. But any last thoughts here before we wrap up on the importance of this?
I have a further thought on Tom. We are the director's cut, and most good Broadway shows will do an after action after every show. And a good director is likely to say things like, you know, Tom, you took some creative license today with your character. Help me understand, even if I didn't like it, help me understand what you were doing. So those help me kinds of questions, whether it's after action in combat, fighter pilots do that after every mission as well. These help me understand what you're doing with that character, and then you take it from there. But this idea of, you may not be able to debrief after every meeting, but we know what the critical meetings are. And as you pointed out, Dan, if it's a part of the normal process, you can make sure that all the voices are heard and avoid confrontation just by having the right process in place.
Yeah.
So I love what you were saying with that, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, I agree. Really fast before you wrap up, the reason that I think that's so important, and you see that in everything, right? Like, I used to do that after piano recitals or concerts. I used to, you know, like coaches do that after a play or after a game. The reason that that's so impactful is because that's how we learn, right? Like when we go back and we revisit something and we view ourselves within the greater social dynamic, and we kind of review a situation, we think about it, that is how we learn, like, and start to develop that muscle memory or those neural networks or any other aspect that then allows us to move forward. Whether that is, you know, taking things that worked really well or understanding what didn't work well. You can unpack what failed or what didn't work, and you can continue to do what is working. And it also is just, you know, it's part of social learning theory, how we interact with our environments. And so I think that's why that's so powerful, and why it should be, you know, as we've been talking, that should just be processed. Take a time to like review with, you know, with one person, with a team. It's so important, and it keeps you engaged because you're learning.
Thank you, Laura. I always love when we land at a place where we're we have a very tangible takeaway. Tom, thank you for these AARs that we can walk away with and immediately kind of put into practice. But let me
sorry, one last thing. Sorry. The other thing that does, the AAR, is it prevents the bad actors from coming out. Because if they know that at the very end of a situation that you're going to have a group discussion, maybe they won't be so cavalier, right? And it's going to kind of keep them in check because they know at the end of the day they're going to get reviewed by their peers, and so it's a good way to keep in check the bad actors from coming to the surface. So sorry.
And maybe just in a public setting too, Tom. Like if that's just understood, like that may be a little not always appropriate, but if there's at least a level at which things can be addressed in a public setting, that also I think is probably good for everybody in the end. So good. Well, again, I've enjoyed our time here on this topic, and Brian, thank you. This is an important one, a really important one. And I think kind of where we started here is really with the role of the leader in managing tension and managing conflict, and being one, Brian, to your point that you hit right away, the leader's role is to ensure that the ideas come out, that there's an environment in which people are comfortable bringing those to the surface, and that involves directly managing the tension in the room. Tom, to your point that you hit very shortly after, that involves knowing yourself, knowing your team, and how far you can take that before that needs to be leveraged into a moment to maybe take a step back, to relax, get a cup of coffee, and maybe put your hubris aside for a second, and acknowledge where things maybe got off the rails a little bit or maybe went too far, which can engender respect for you as a leader, or just an engager in the debate, and put things back on a level footing as well. We talked about the difference, Laura, thank you, between conflict and confrontation, and between dialogue and debate, and the importance of both of those. And we talked about how we recover as well. Thank you, Brian. How we can recover from more challenging sorts of situations and leverage some of that conflict and confrontation into more creative outcomes. I think we landed here again to be reminded, of course, Tom, to your point, attack the problem, not the person. Trying to get the leader's job, of course, also being to ensure that everyone's rowing in the same direction, and that we're focused on an outcome here collectively, and we're all on the same page. And that healthy conflict is a really healthy thing. Apathy is actually the enemy, Laura, to your point, and that's something we should be reminded of in our personal relationships too. That you still have a pulse and things are still alive, and there's still hope if you're fighting. And so how do we keep people fighting is another very, very important thing. And Tom, I love that we landed on a very immediate, tangible takeaway here, the importance of an AAR, an after-action review, and that the importance of people just knowing that as part of the process may help to keep people at the table throughout the process as you're going, recognizing there will be a chance to air our differences and get to a better place long-term. And that's an important part of the creative process. So, guys, thank you very much. I've appreciated our time. Looking forward to our next session as always. And thank you to our listeners and everyone who's joined us today. We'll see you guys again at 11 a.m. Eastern, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday every week. And in the meantime, never be reminded, of course, of the important thing in the finish line, never trip over dollars to pick up pennies. That's your point. All righty.
Great insight, Mike, Myatt, and Brian.
That's right.
Thank you guys so much. Happy 4th of July.
That's right.
Fourth, guys. Take care.
Bye.